I guess I was about 5 years old when I first began to notice the drinking fountains in grocery stores. One would be labeled white, and the other would be labeled colored. Well, I figured that the water in the white fountain was ordinary, and the water in the colored fountain was something special, like Kool-Aid. So one day I turned them both on, and I discovered that the water in both was the same. It was colorless.
When I was quite young, about 7 or 8 years old, my grandmother and I caught a bus from the 3rd Ward going into town. And when my grandmother turned her back to pay the bus driver, I sat down behind her on the front seat. After she had paid the bus driver, she turned and walked down the aisle toward the back of the bus. When she reached the back, she couldn't find me, and so she came back up toward the front. When she saw me, she said, "You can't sit up there, come on." I asked her why not, and she said black people couldn't ride in the front of the bus. So she took a firm grip on my hand, and off we went to the back of the bus. I didn't fully understand it at the time, and I do remember that I didn't like it. The black citizens of Houston have moved up since the days of the back of the bus. Houston's black community has come up through times of oppression and change. Ever since the city was founded, its black community has been continually going through changes.
The institution of slavery is at the very core of Houston's black history. Slaves came to Texas in great numbers between 1830 and the beginning of the Civil War. The institution of slavery is at the very core of Houston's black history. Slaves came to Texas in great numbers between 1830 and the beginning of the Civil War. By 1860, the Houston census listed 567 female slaves and 502 male slaves. There were 8 free Negroes in Houston.
To pick that white man's cotton. You know it's gonna be just a solid mess.
The plantation system was strong throughout East Texas, and slave labor was at the backbone of its survival. Houston was the site of at least one prominent slave mart, and in 1860, one historian reported having seen signs in shop windows advertising Negroes for sale. Apparently, there were no slave traders who operated in Houston over a long period of time, but the local businessmen dealt with them in the course of their work. Free Negroes were generally thought of as a threat to civic tranquility. They were subject to the same punishment as slaves and the same restrictions. State and local ordinances imposed an 8 p.m. curfew on all blacks. They outlawed the sale or delivery of liquor to slaves. Blacks could not take independent employment without the owner's permission. They could not have dances without the mayor's approval. To suggest that blacks living under these conditions were given an opportunity to learn reading and writing may seem out of the question. But educator Henry Bullock says that some blacks were, in fact, given that luxury.
There were educational opportunities for blacks, limited though they were. In the first place, it was really not profitable to have a dumb slave. So as a result of the large investments that were made in slaves, they had to be trained. And there were many instances in which owners put their slaves out to be trained in apprenticeship, some with some of the best engineers of that time. Also, there was a kind of a working relationship between owners' children and the slaves.
Dr. Bullock goes on to suggest that the educational opportunities given slaves gave rise to a black intellectual class. Although it was small in number, it helped to kindle the fires of the abolitionist movement and the Civil War that followed. Houston, like Texas, was not centrally involved in the Civil War, but many volunteered for war service in units such as the Bayou City Guards and Houston Artillery. News of the surrender of Robert E. Lee was bad news in Houston, but slave traffic nevertheless came to a halt. Blacks in Texas were emancipated on June 19, 1865. So many freed Negroes came to Houston after emancipation that the town enforced a 9 p.m. curfew to keep them off the streets and threatened to put unemployed Negroes to work without pay. But nothing could erase the joy of freedom. Meanwhile, many of the blacks who had lived as slaves on the premises of their masters remained there, working as domestic servants. These continued arrangements produced a racial balance in the city's wards, although there were some pockets of Negro concentration. Racial balance, however, was not long in disappearing from the Houston scene. Segregation deepened during the period from 1875 to 1930, almost to the point of forming two societies connected only by economic necessity. Segregation was firmly established in Houston churches and schools.
The real point that established segregation was in 1873, I think it was 1873, in the slaughterhouse case. Now, this was a case argued on the basis of the 14th Amendment that had nothing to do with blacks whatever. As a matter of fact, it was with slaughtering in New Orleans. But what the court did in that case was actually to create two kinds of citizenship. One was a citizenship that was tied with the individual's, the fact that the individual was a citizen of the United States. The other was the fact that he was a citizen of a given state. And the court ruled that the makers of the amendment provided for these two citizenships. So it split the citizenship of the Americans straight down the middle.
In the early years of the 20th century, separate white-only and colored-only facilities appeared in city buildings, places of business, and public conveyances all over Houston. Many of today's black Houstonians have not forgotten those years.
You'd get on the streetcar and the colored section would be full, and there'd be a half a dozen seats empty in front, but you had to stand up. If you wanted to use a bathroom in town, you had to pick a special place. These kinds of inconveniences, plus the fact that very seldom did the kind of whites that you came in contact with deem it necessary to give you any courtesy. There was very little, if any, hospital care of Negroes before I became a grown man. The first hospital for Negroes was built through donations from a philanthropic family here. Cullinan, I believe the name is. It was called the Negro Hospital. There, in the charity hospitals, there were segregated wards. This meant Jeff Davis and Herman. In the private hospitals, there was usually no provision at all for Negro patients.
Houston's black community responded to Jim Crowism by duplicating the activities and organizations of the white community. Blacks established their own churches and church organizations. They acquired their own $15,000 Carnegie Library, built in 4th Ward in the heart of one of Houston's black neighborhoods. The black community developed its own class consciousness, too. Doctors, lawyers, educators, and ministers were among the very prominent. Many of the well-to-do were of the mind that racial barriers were indeed God's will, and that a man must prove the worthiness of his life within the racial barriers set for him. Blacks, however, were not entirely submissive to racial prejudice even then. A near riot erupted in 1910 when a mixed crowd had mixed feelings about the result of a heavyweight bout between Jack Johnson and James Jeffries. 7 years later, a full-scale race riot did erupt, and it all centered around a place called Camp Logan.
This railroad sign on Washington Avenue was one of the few remaining items to indicate there ever was a Camp Logan in Houston. When America entered the First World War, the camp was built to train National Guard units. This was once the location of quite an active depot where troopers from the north arrived to guard the camp during its construction. Camp Logan was located west of town at the present site of Memorial Park. Today it is a scenic residential area characterized by spacious, well-kept homes. The residents here probably have little, if any, idea of the intense racial turmoil that brewed on these very grounds 65 years ago.
It's America! It's freedom!
The northern troopers stationed here were predominantly black, and they resented the segregated facilities as well as the prejudices Houston had to offer. Only the smallest flame was necessary to set off a racial explosion in the camp. That flame was lit on the morning of August 23, 1917. According to records at the Department of Defense in Washington, a Houston police officer on duty in 4th Ward broke up a dice game among some Negro boys. The report stated that he followed the boys into a house and then appeared again outside, striking a colored woman. One of the officers of the 24th Infantry intervened and was, in turn, beaten up by the policeman and arrested. The same scene was repeated only hours later when another Negro officer, Corporal Charles Baltimore, asked the arresting police officer the reason for the arrest. A scuffle resulted. The policeman overtook Baltimore, beat him severely, and arrested him. Word got back to the all-black 24th Infantry at Camp Logan that Baltimore had been murdered by a policeman. There was excitement. By 8 o'clock that evening, men in Company I were loading their rifles. Some of the men were quoted as shouting, "Let's go to town and get to work. To hell with going to France. Let's get to work right here." The men left camp. They moved toward town, firing round after round of ammunition all along the way. 100 to 150 soldiers moved 4 blocks east on Washington Street, then 1 mile south to San Felipe Street.
The 1920s, the jazz age. Hymnlines were up and the spirit in Houston was up too. Movies began to talk and the new Majestic Theater went up on Rusk Street. It housed the very latest in film and vaudeville entertainment. Inside there was a separate seating area for colored theatergoers, but just a few blocks away on Prairie Street, Negroes could sit anywhere they wanted in the Lincoln Theater. Today the building is decayed, but in the 20s it was the hub of motion picture and live entertainment for Negroes. Meanwhile, Houston was fast becoming a city of skyscrapers and big industrial plants. Already it was one of the leading ports in the country. In a city of such great prosperity, it was inevitable that a few drops of the good fortune would spill over into black hands. Negroes began to acquire the material possessions like automobiles. The next best thing to owning one was knowing someone who did. Black Houstonians were amazed at the progress they seemed to be making in health and education. A new hospital for colored was built, and 2 colored high schools, Wheatley in 5th Ward and Yates in 3rd Ward. Up until that time, Negro children in these areas had been required to travel all the way across town to the only colored high school in the city. The arch rivalry that developed between Yates and Wheatley led to an era of excitement and enthusiasm for blacks throughout the city. In 1927, blacks made that important first step into higher education when the Houston Colored Junior College opened on the Yates campus. The future of Negro education looked bright then. Enthusiasm among Negro teachers and students was strong enough to overshadow the ills of a segregated school system. The future of black political power did not look so bright. Negroes were denied the right to vote in Democratic primary elections, and at the 1928 Democratic National Convention in Houston, Negroes were restricted to an area fenced off with chicken wire. In the midst of all the hoopla, little if any attention was given to that quiet injustice. The 30s produced no major changes in Houston's race relations. There was controversy over the construction of the new Southern Pacific Grand Central Station because Negroes and whites would have to use the same ramps to reach the trains. The polarization of black and white was by this time hardened tradition, and it was destined to stay that way for at least another 2 decades. But in 1944, a slight crack in that tradition occurred where it perhaps was needed most, in politics. A black Houston dentist, Dr. Lonnie Smith, took the white primary issue to court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. That decision led to an increase in black voting power, and the whole political movement in Houston's black community began to mature. Meanwhile, there was one white man in particular who grew to be quite popular in Houston's black neighborhoods. He was, in fact, the creator of many colored residential areas. In 1936, Evan Edward Worthing had begun building a real estate empire, specializing in low-rent housing for colored. His tenement houses still stand today in Houston's black low-income districts. Before his death in 1951, Worthing had become a familiar face among the people who lived here. One of Worthing's employees remembers the rapport between the landlord and his Negro tenants.
He has realized that so many women worked and had to pay the rent. And when they'd come and pay him up and sit and look, he said, well, what can I do for you? I need about $3. All right, he'd give it to them. But in the meantime, he says, how do you want to pay it? Just as you say. He'd debit their cards with $3 and let them pay 50 cents a week. And he also would lend his tenants larger sums if they wanted to educate their children.
Negro education became one of Worthing's main interests, and before his death, $1,350,000 of the Worthing fortune had already been earmarked for that cause. After 1951, the fortune was inherited by black high school graduates in the form of scholarships for college education. This constituted another breakthrough for black Houstonians in the 50s, but many racial barriers still had to be overcome.
One of my first jobs was at a service station in an affluent white neighborhood here in Houston. I was about 16. 3 people worked at the station, an old black guy, a young white guy, and myself. One day a customer's radiator was damaged. The boss said we'd all have to pay for it and he'd take it out of next week's check. The white guy told me later he didn't plan to pay for the man's radiator out of his pocket. When payday came, he showed me his check. And sure enough, he hadn't paid for the man's radiator, but we had. I was pretty upset about it. I told the black guy that the white guy hadn't paid 1 cent for the man's radiator. He looked at me and said, well, you didn't think he would, did you?
Memories of Jim Crowism are still very fresh in the minds of many of Houston's black citizens. Jim Crow was very much a part of Houston in the 50s, but the city would be challenged to meet the needs of all its citizens. Negroes were determined to be a part of the total society, and in the next 20 years, they repeatedly challenged the segregated system. In 1950, 5 Negroes filed suit to use a municipal golf course. In 1953, the NAACP protested the segregated cafeteria of the new county courthouse. In 1956, 2 years after the Supreme Court declared segregated schools unconstitutional, a few Negroes tried and failed to register at white Houston schools. The NAACP filed suit on behalf of 2 youngsters. In 1952, a black family bought a $26,000 home on Wichita Street in the fashionable white residential area of Riverside Terrace. The family was approached repeatedly by an association of its white neighbors who wanted to buy them out. Their efforts failed, and in April of the following year, those first months of tension and anger were thought to have subsided. Then, on April 16th, 4 sticks of dynamite shattered the early morning silence before daybreak. The family sleeping in the rear of the house was unharmed, and within 20 hours, police had charged 2 men with the bombing. The house on Wichita and much of Riverside Terrace today has been raised to make room for the South Freeway. But Jack Caesar, a successful cattle buyer, remembers that at the time he could well afford a newer and better home.
We had money at that time, and the wife wanted to buy, and it wasn't a matter of moving the neighborhood. You couldn't find nice homes nowhere but in that neighborhood, and so we just bought into it without knowing what the consequence would be. So at that time, I think I bought a house cost $26,500, and I paid $12,000 something down on it, and we just moved in there without the knowledge of knowing what was going to happen. And after we got in there, everything blew up. I was staying there for a long time, and they thought white owned it, and I was living there, caretaker. You know, I guess I was in there about 3 months or longer, and they thought, because everybody in the neighborhood, some of the rich homes was being taken care of by Negro chauffeurs and maids and things, and the people was gone for months, and so they thought that's what we were doing. After they found out we bought the home, that's when they ganged up on us and finally led to the bombing.
Caesars was the first black family to enter Riverside, but by no means was it the last. Many of the whites panicked and fled, and today, 14 years later, Riverside Terrace is 98% black. A current resident of Riverside Terrace is Mrs. Charles E. White, the first Negro elected to the Houston School Board. In 1958, Mrs. White, elected by a combination of blacks and whites, was the only liberal on a conservative school board.
There was never a time during the 9 years that I sat on the board that the board itself determined that it would meet with blacks to get the feel or to work out a solution fairly satisfactory to both black and white. The issue was just avoided. All decisions in relation to court fights or in relation to the policies that we followed in desegregation matters were determined by the attorney, who was Joe Reynolds. If we lost a decision or if we were ordered to do something, the board never discussed openly and as a full board whether or not we would appeal the decision or whether we would continue to spend tax funds fighting desegregation. We just followed whatever was the dictate of the attorney. And so practically nothing was done.
Under an accelerated program, desegregation was completed between 1966 and 1967, but the apparent trauma of the process caused many problems that to date are still unresolved. The tempo of change increased during the 60s, whereas the issue of school desegregation was and is continuing to undergo evolution. Restrictions in other areas were challenged and resolved, although not without a fight. One example involved segregated public facilities. On March 4, 1960, 17 brave and determined young students from Texas Southern University started a student protest movement, later to be known as the Progressive Youth Association. The students sat in at lunch counters and took to the streets with their protests. The sit-inners challenged segregated eating facilities at many of the downtown department store chains and at the City Hall cafeteria. By 1964, most discrimination in public facilities and in city-owned buildings had ended. In 1966, 2 blacks were elected to the Texas legislature. State Senator Barbara Jordan and Representative Curtis Graves were forerunners of what seemed to be a small but growing vanguard of black politicians. The times were changing, but there was still much fear and frustration and distrust in Houston. Many whites wondered, what do the blacks want now? A few whites listened as a few blacks attempted to articulate the frustrations of the community, but somehow, while all the rhetoric was going on, both sides were caught unawares by the TSU disturbance. The school that produced those 17 brave and determined young students just a few years before became a school embroiled in a nightmare.
On May 16th and 17th of 1967, a series of disturbances at the Texas Southern University campus shook the foundation of Houston. No one knows how it started. On On the surface, it began when undercover policeman R.G. Blaylock was shot in the backside. Police were sent to the campus, tempers flared and tension mounted, and someone fired that first shot. No one knows who. Then Police Chief Herman Short met with civil rights leaders. Reverend Earl Allen wanted police cars taken from the campus so he could talk to students. There were hundreds of male students in the men's dorms, and they did not want to come out. Mayor Louis Welch said he did not want to bargain with criminals. With both sides squaring off like this, it's no wonder Reverend F.D. Kirkpatrick failed when he tried to talk to students in the dorms. Soon, gasoline and tar barrels in the middle of Wheeler Street erupted in flames, effectively blocking the street. At the time, Wheeler Street was open to traffic. About 650 police and sheriff's officers closed in again, and they say sniper fire increased. Police sent tear gas missiles at the dorms, and it was here that police officer Louis R. Cooper was shot. He was standing about 10 feet from Big 2 newsman Jack Long. Police told the students to surrender, and they finally did. The students were marched from the dorms. Each man was searched and told to lie on the ground. Then about 500 people were taken to the Harris County Jail. When it was all over, 4 people were hurt. Student Morris English had been shot in the back. Officer Cooper died. Police officer Alan Duggar had been shot in the face, and undercover police officer Blaylock had a bullet in his backside. University officials blamed outsiders. TSU's dean of students blamed police. He said they overdid it. Police blamed the students, and the students charged police brutality. There were a lot of hearings held, but no one could get at the root of the problem. A man had been killed, and the grand jury could not say who was to blame. It's possible he was killed by a ricocheting bullet from a policeman's gun. Several eyewitnesses say Officer Cooper was standing by a wall in such a position that it was impossible for him to get hit by gunfire from the other dorm. 5 students were charged with rioting. A difficult-to-prove law makes it possible to blame everyone taking part in a disturbance for damage to life, limb, and property. The students were indicted by a Harris County grand jury for murder and assault to murder. They soon became known as the TSU 5. One of the 5 was tried in Waller County. He was convicted of unlawfully possessing a pistol. Another was tried in Victoria and released after deliberations resulted in a hung jury. The charges against the other 3 were dropped. That's what happened at TSU in 1967. No one can say why it happened. The TSU affair was perhaps the most sensational case during the 60s, involving a clash between Houston's black community and the police. But troubles between blacks and police did not end there. The Leotis Johnson case is a grim reminder. Leotis Johnson was arrested on April 16, 1968. He was charged with possession of marijuana. He had been indicted earlier for selling grass to undercover Houston narcotics officer Bill M. Williams, and this indictment also said Johnson had marijuana in his possession. At the time of his arrest, Johnson said it was a trumped-up charge. He said he had been arrested because police were afraid he would inflame the people. In August of 1968, Leotis Johnson tried to get his trial moved from Houston on a change of venue. His defense felt he could not get a fair trial in Houston because his militant activities were too well known and would prejudice any jury. The change of venue was denied. Johnson was then tried by an all-white jury, found guilty of selling marijuana, and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Johnson later got a hearing for a new trial. At the hearing, Mayor Louis Welch and Police Chief Herman Short said there was no conspiracy by the city of Houston to persecute Johnson, as Johnson had accused. The plea for a new trial was refused, and Judge Wendell Odom formally sentenced Johnson to 30 years. Within 2 weeks, a Harris County grand jury said, without mentioning names, one individual in Harris County was given 30 years for possession of marijuana, while a convicted murderer was given a 2-year probated sentence. Leotis Johnson quickly became a cause for Houston's black community. When Governor Preston Smith came to the University of Houston in October of 1970. Hundreds of students, black and white, met him shouting. The governor wanted to know what they had against frijoles. Someone had to tell the governor they were actually saying free leotis. One local paper said the governor did not know leotis from beans, but most of Houston did. By 1972, the Johnson cause has drawn sympathies from many quarters. Most of the black community is behind him now. District Judge Carl Bew has said Johnson had not had a fair trial because he was tried in a community that was prejudiced against him. Johnson was set free on June 2nd. He is now awaiting a retrial.
In the 1970s, Houston is one of the major urban centers of the world. Black Houstonians in the 70s reflect the characteristics of contemporary urban life. As Houston continues to grow, so does its black population. Blacks have increased in numbers from 215,000 in 1960 to over 316,000 in 1970. Already, they, together with Mexican Americans, outnumber whites in the population of school children within the Houston School District. Blacks have adopted varied lifestyles, but all are characteristically urban. There are some, but not many, who live like the John Stones. Their house is a majestic structure in the affluent black neighborhood of Timbercrest. The Stones have lived here for 5 years, and it took as many years to build the home. John Stone is a physician. His wife, Gertrude, is devoted to community activities as well as to the rearing of their 3 children. The Stones represent a small but ever-increasing segment of Houston's black population, characterized by gracious living. An even greater segment of Houston's black population is characterized by lifestyles that are somewhat less luxurious, but not without a certain degree of affluence. The typical professions in this group include school teaching, industry's white-collar positions, and some blue-collar positions. Often, both parents work, and they can well afford 2 cars, as well as college education for the children. The income group that tends to get into the public eye most often is that characterized by poverty or near poverty.
Spend it on the have-nots. Money, we make it. Before we see it, you take it. Oh, make me wanna holler the way they do my life. Yeah. Make me wanna holler the way they do my life. This ain't living, this ain't living. No, no, baby, this ain't living. No, 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 no. Inflation, no chance to increase finance. Bills pile up, sky high. Send that boy off to die. Oh, make me wanna holler the way they do my life. Yeah, make me wanna holler the way they do my life.
But there is evidence that the well-to-do as well as the poor in predominantly black neighborhoods are victims of consumer inequities. Eugene Harrington of the Texas Southern University Preventive Law Center has studied trade practices in predominantly black areas.
Some of the stores we found, for instance, were claiming, and they do claim periodically, to have going out of business sales, when in fact they are not going out of business. We have found evidence that they perhaps sell used goods for new goods, reclaimed goods, repossessed goods for new goods, which also is a deceptive trade practice under Texas law. We found in a more subtle way that some of the chain stores, some of the chain food stores that exist in the 3rd Ward and in Riverside and the communities around here do tend to charge more for certain items than they do in their more affluent counterpart. As an example, for instance, we found that Weingarten's charges 14 cents more per TV dinner in their 3rd Ward store than they do out in their Town and Country or their Galleria store.
Some say black consumers might get a fair shake if all businesses in their neighborhoods were owned by blacks. Some of Houston's black businessmen are working toward that end now. Black involvement in business activities in Houston used to be a limited venture, mainly because of the inability to get large sums of money to finance operations. The black food houses, barber and beauty shops, auto repair shops and such have been here for some time, but on small scales. Only one black business has been able to establish itself as a giant in Houston, and that's the black funeral service business. But today, the black businessman is trying to break into the mainstreams of big business in our town. The largest black automobile dealer in town is C.G. Hardy. He runs C.O.D. Hardy Motor Company in the 2200 block of East X Freeway. Hardy has been around cars all of his life. His family started the first black-owned and operated service station in Texas in 1926. It was over on Liberty Road, and Hardy took it over in 1949. In 54, he started selling cars, and in 66, he moved to his East Tex Freeway location. Hardy says over 98% of his business is black. He says he gets some white business, but when most whites realize a black man is running the show, they leave. The Yates Printing and Litho Company is in the 4600 block of Alameda. It was started by relatives of black educator Jack Yates in 1921. Now R.B.H. Yates runs it, and he gets some assistance from his wife and son. They do commercial printing and boast the largest sheet size in Houston. Mr. Yates says his gross sales are now running about $65,000 a year. And almost every Houstonian knows about Judson Robinson and Sons in the 2900 block of Elgin. Judson Sr. started the business in 1947. He had only a part-time secretary. But now Judson Jr. has joined the business, and together they employ 17 highly trained professionals. The Robinson business is primarily a mortgage company as well as a real estate and general insurance agency. They service about $7 million and provide expertise in fields of housing, finance, and insurance. Judson Robinson and Sons was the first FHA VA mortgagee operated by blacks in this city. A man named J.A. Singletary says back in the 50s, he was not allowed to park in front of this hotel. He was a taxi cab driver then, and he had to park across the street from the William Penn Hotel. Well, now Singletary owns this hotel, and he is believed to be the first black man to own a major hotel in Houston. The hotel is one of downtown Houston's major landmarks, and Singletary says since he took it over, it has continued to draw a capacity crowd. And by the way, Singletary doesn't park his car across the street anymore either. Entertainment has always been an elusive and very unpredictable market. Nightlife in Houston was a Friday night, Saturday night affair, followed by a recovery on Sunday and a return to work on Monday. Then Ray Barnett came along with 7 days a week of entertainment, and a lot of people woke up with hangovers every day. His first club was the Cinder, and the people packed in, first the blacks and later everyone. Barnett says Houston needed good local entertainment on a continuous basis. Apparently it was a good idea because it caught on and nightlife developed throughout the city. And so did Barnett. He owns a number of clubs now. Houston has an abundance of young talent, and Ray Barnett was the first to create a market for it. And now everyone has discovered this young local talent is cheaper than the big names. Riverside National Bank got its charter in 1962. It was the first time since Reconstruction a national bank charter was granted to a mostly black group. Scholars at Texas Southern University have proven time and again blacks paid more interest than whites for the same loans. Riverside founders saw a need for a black national bank for the black community. However, they opened their doors to all of Houston. Today, Riverside National Bank has over $11,009,000 and total deposits of more than $9,800,000. Standard Savings and Loan in the 4300 block of Dowling is the brainchild of Mac Hanna. Hanna says when they first opened for business in 1959, they took accounts as small as 25 cents to encourage people to save. Hanna says blacks spend 110% of what they earn. He says there had long been a need for a financial institution for blacks, as well as a need for more young blacks to go into this type of business. Now Standard handles over 500 accounts of more than $5 million. Mac Hanna likes to think of Standard as a thrift institution. This is George Glover, a chemist and an ink manufacturer. The Glover Quality Ink Company is the only black-owned and operated ink manufacturing company in the United States. Glover has developed a specialty. He makes private colored ink for businesses. He sells businessmen on the idea of having their own special color. With his knowledge of ink and mixing compound, coupled with an imagination for new colors, Glover has produced up to 500 different colors. He also makes ink for commercial printers and industry. He says the most popular color is his warm red. Glover and his 5 employees made more than 1 million pounds of ink in 1971 alone. One business venture remains unconquered, at least for blacks. Black advertising agencies are not making it in Houston and across the nation. Luther Walker believes it's because there is a black market being taken for granted by everyone. Walker says there is no distinction made between the minority and the general consumer market. And for this reason, Luther Walker and Associates in the 4600 block of Alameda is forced to compete with larger agencies on their own grounds. He says he cannot get the larger loans from downtown banks. He is against the Small Business Administration loans of the federal government because he says the money is too restricted. Walker would like the loans, but he does not want others telling him how to run his business as long as he uses the money in the business. He says advertising is a new concept in the black community, and a lot of people don't understand it. Because of this, Walker says he is barely able to keep above water. Houston's black businessmen seem to want to expand outside the community market because many of them say it is the only way they will survive and grow. Most of them feel the black community as a whole does not support them. From all indications, they are right. The community tells the black businessman he has an obligation to them, and yet no one feels obligated to him. The majority of the businessmen I have talked with say they are getting pressures from some whites because the whites do not want the competition. With no community support, they say they cannot make a public stand because they have everything to lose and nothing to gain. One of the larger and well-known of the businessmen tells me he fears he will not last long. He says, certain people in Houston feel he is getting too big. But the black businessmen cannot be ignored. They're a part of Houston. Some are drowning, some are floating, some are paddling, and some are stroking away.
The success of blacks in business and finance is considered by many to be the definition of black power. The term also encompasses black political power. In the 1970s, blacks have made important strides in politics with the election of Judson Robinson Jr. to the Houston City Council, thus integrating that body for the first time since Reconstruction. More recently, 4 Houston blacks were victorious in the Democratic primary race for state legislative seats, and 1 black was elected in the corresponding Republican primary race. These events mark a significant change for black Houstonians in the 1970s. But perhaps the most significant change in the 70s is one of attitude. Memories of the strife as well as the conquests of yesteryear are in the minds of today's black citizens. Those memories have given rise to the new black consciousness. Young and old alike in Houston's black community have come to realize that their heritage and cultural idiosyncrasies are nothing to be ashamed of and something indeed to be proud of. There is criticism from some whites that black consciousness is racial prejudice in reverse. Some say it ultimately leads to bloodshed, like that on Dowling Street in the summer of 1970. But black people say the essence of black consciousness is constructive, not destructive. They say they are seeking unity and strength among themselves for the ultimate good of society as a whole. Blacks wish to come together in common pursuit of the power to control their own destinies without fear of exploitation from the outside. Blacks argue that in this regard, they are no different from the Jews, Italian Americans, or any other minority groups that seemingly take care of their own through collective effort. Black consciousness is the force that gives all black Houstonians something in common, regardless of their incomes and lifestyles. Many reflect the new attitude in their hairstyles. Whether or not the afro is here to stay is a subject of conflicting opinions. But black consciousness in itself is apparently no passing fancy. Houston's black community has changed during times of oppression, challenge, and confrontation. Still, there is a feeling among blacks that all of their battles are not yet over. Not until the rest of the world can fully equate blackness with human dignity. That change may come eventually, as the attitudes in all of society continue going through changes.